Good afternoon or good evening, everybody. My name is Kuben Naidu. I'm the Deputy Governor of the South African Reserve Bank. It's really good that there is so much interest, nearly 500 people from all over South Africa and many other countries online today for today's conversations. Firstly, congratulations to the CDE on your 25th anniversary. This is the fourth webinar in the series celebrating 25 years since CDE's launch back in August 1995. The Center for Development and Enterprise's core focus is on how this country can consolidate our democracy and achieve higher growth, jobs, and prosperity that we desperately need. They do this in many different ways through policy research, facts to matter, and active dissemination of findings, analyses, and recommendations. And I should say, they add to a very robust public debate. CDE regularly hosts events where South Africans from all walks of life are exposed to new ideas, alternative ways of achieving common goals. The importance of independent think tanks like the CDE cannot be underestimated in our society and in our policy debates. Its valuable contribution is through its ability to tap global experts for the benefit of the country. For many years, CDE has invested in identifying the experts from around the world who have knowledge or practical experience that could help navigate South Africa's many challenges. Before I hand over to Ann to introduce Martin Wolf, I'd like to reflect on two themes. The first, captured in an article by Martin Wolf on the 24th of November 2015, describes what I think is the most accurate description of South Africa's most intractable problem: how to escape a Bell India trap. In this article, Wolf describes South Africa, as Edmar Bacha had described Brazil, as a country with a Bell India problem, Belgium inside India, a wealthy, high productivity, largely white enclave inside a poor India. There are no easy answers to the problem of solving a Bell India type problem, and even fewer options in a democracy. This brings me to the second theme and the main theme for today's discussion. What is the relationship between democracy and open markets? Can we conceive of a developmental strategy that achieves both open and free markets on the one hand and democratic social norms on the other? In many ways, implicit in South Africa's social contract and in our constitution is an open and democratic society with largely free markets combined with the state that attempts to play an intervening role to drive development and social progress for all its citizens. Is that model still relevant in today's world? I'm really looking forward to Martin's comments on these topics today. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to CDE Virtual. It's my great privilege to welcome Martin Wolf and to have him on the CDE platform today. Martin has received many honors in his illustrious career. He's been called the Anglosphere's most influential financial journalist. He is an international best-selling author of numerous books, and he is the recipient of 6 honorary doctorates and an honorary fellow at 2 Oxford colleges and at King's College London. 2 years ago, he received a Lifetime Achievement Award in New York, and I liked what he said there. He said, "My views have changed as the world has changed. I make no apology for this. Those who have not changed their opinions over a lifetime do not think. But my values have not altered. I inherited them from my parents, both refugees from Hitler's Europe. I believe in democracy and in the obligations of citizenship, in individual liberty and freedom of opinion, and in the primacy of truth. The role of the Fourth Estate is to serve these great causes, and I am proud to have been one of its servants." In my conversation with Martin today, I'm going to ask him to tell us about his new book, The Crisis of Democratic Capitalism, and his views on how to save it. I'm also going to provoke him on some other topics that are relevant for South Africa and that he and I have talked about in the past. So a whirlwind tour of Martin's views, about half an hour on his new book, and then some related and different topics. So Martin, What is your new book about?
Well, first of all, I should say that I have the last chapter to finish, which is why I'm working at home at the moment and not writing, but it's nearly finished. The book is, I suppose, about where we are particularly in the developed world today, and how we fit into the world, and particularly the relationship between what I think of as our two foundational systems in the contemporary world, namely our democratic political system, our commitment, therefore, to universal suffrage, and that is to liberal democracy, so a democracy based on the rule of law, free political association, the rights of protest, and therefore a competitive politics. And at the same time, the other foundational principle of our society, which is a competitive market economy, which is often called capitalism, though I don't think it's the ideal world, but I'm thinking of a competitive market economy, which is also open to the world, and for which, therefore, the world as a whole and competition from the world matters. And the core of this is that this relationship between the two, globally, I think, but particularly in the developed world, is under enormous stress, partly internally because of things that have happened to us, and partly because the world has changed. And in particular, we're seeing the rise of a genuine rival, which might be called autocratic or maybe autocratic bureaucratic capitalism of the type we see in particular in China.
If we look at history for a moment, Martin, what is the relationship between democracy and capitalism? Why did the development of market economies generate a rise in democratic rights, in your view?
I think that is a really deep question and very important. So this is the good story, as it were, though it has many complicated nuances. So if you look at the sort of standard measures of democracy, there are many databases that provide this. And you go back to 1800, there's one in particular that goes back to 1800. There were no democracies in the sense we mean by democracy. That is to say, a polity in which there was close to universal suffrage. I don't even mean universal suffrage because obviously the emancipation of women, as you know well, came rather late, even in democracies. But there were incredibly limited franchises, tiny numbers of people who could vote, basically the wealthy. So they have to be called oligarchies, not democracies, or plutocracies alternatively. And of course, the great mass of humanity were equally incredibly poor. I mean, we know this from lots of work. That was the world in 1800. Of course, some countries were more powerful than others, but that was the world in 1800. Then, and I won't go into the history of why this happened, in some parts of the world, the Industrial Revolution took off and began to prove completely transformative economically. It created enormous economic and social and cultural change and many stresses. But as it advanced and incomes per head started to rise, particularly in the latter part of the 19th century, some very profound changes happened in society. We saw urbanization, the rise in the ability, because people worked in factories, to organize, the rise of trades unions. We saw an increased demand from the people and from employers for education. They wanted educated workers. So universal education began to be introduced by highly authoritarian countries and countries that were moving towards democracy. There was a rising middle class that demanded a political say. And pretty well everywhere, this either led to brutal reaction or widening of the franchise progressively and increasingly in the UK, in the US, There was the war against slavery, which I think is also related to this. It was a war, if you like, between free labor of the North and enslaved labor. So there was a cultural change, an intellectual change, and profound political change, such that by the end of the 19th century, in many Western countries, you were seeing very close to universal male suffrage. And after the First World War, actually it started before, but by the 1930s, most countries had universal suffrage. So in a relatively short period, this market economic system found itself in a political context of universal suffrage and what we think of now as our form of democracy.
Let me move you to the present day and ask you to talk a bit about how you see the conflict between capitalism and democracy in the world today.
I think even there we can remember that a lot of the history I've described was a history of tension and conflict. And there have always been tensions between, Marx was not the first to notice this, but he was probably the most important. The tension in a successful market economy, there have always tended to be a limited number of very big winners, the capitalists, the owners of a vast amount of capital. They have, of course, power, and they wish to protect their position. And there are, of course, a vast mass of people who are much less well off and want security, greater security, and will start electing people who will demand this. So there's a tension. And what has to happen for this to work, and this will come to why we are now, for this to work is some sort of balance, a reasonable balance, so that people feel they have opportunity, their children have opportunity, that they have reasonable security, reasonable chances of a good job. And if they do get that, they are perfectly prepared to allow business to prosper and some people to do enormously well. And this balance is constantly fought over. And I would say that in the developed world, in the 50s and 60s, particularly, this balance had been struck pretty well, though it followed a catastrophic period of the 30s and the Second World War. Over the last 40 years or so, this balance has, I think, for various reasons, and that's the core of my book, become destabilized in the developed world. Meanwhile, which is, I think, implicit in the question that was asked by Mr. Naidu, developing countries is really difficult because they're at a much earlier level of development. They're going through many of the stresses of the 19th century, which led to really huge social and economic problems, and the vulnerability to autocratic takeover is, I think, even greater. And we've seen that happen all across the world, quite apart from the Chinese phenomenon. Again and again, the new democracies that have emerged, particularly in the 80s and 90s, after the decolonization period, and then a lot of autocratic regimes emerged, they collapsed, and then we're now seeing a return of autocracy in many, many countries. But in the core thing of my book is how this, what I call social contract, the contract of modern citizenship, started to break down in the developed world. And that has led to what some people call the Democratic Recession.
Martin, let's turn to that now, what you call the unhappy high-income democracies. In your view, what are the myths about how people are talking about this situation? And what are the realities that are causing this unhappiness, the inequalities, and the political reaction, in your view? How do you see it?
Well, there's a very complex and intense debate, and I'm not sure there are so many myths so as trying to get hold of what is a very complicated set of developments. There is one point of view which I don't ignore altogether, but I think tends to be very exaggerated. Perhaps that's because I'm an economist and view things as an economist. And that view is essentially what you're seeing, say, in the United States or in Britain with Brexit, in France with the Front National, the AfD, Alternative for Deutschland, which was very popular recently in Germany, is essentially a cultural backlash. And the cultural backlash is associated with hostility to immigration, particularly. That's very clear, but also with hostility to the changing position of ethnic groups in society, and also even more broadly to the changing position of women in society. So if you like, it's our reactionary backlash against cultural change, some of which is associated with economic change. Immigration is obviously an economic as well as a social phenomenon. And I think there's something in all that, but to me, a lot of this is symptomatic. That is to say, the really big problem is that the economic processes that drove greater equality in the 20th century, and particularly in the middle of the 20th century, and the political solutions that underpinned that the new bargain, the new contract, if you like, of the middle of the 20th century, this has basically been undermined by a series of very powerful economic changes, which have led, and this is, we can only discuss it briefly because there's so much, which have led essentially to the destruction of the old working class. And the economic position of the old working class has disappeared, and many find themselves now trapped with very little hope of getting out, and increasingly divided from the more successful members of the middle and upper middle classes and the new emerged hyper wealthy global capitalists. So we've got social fragmentation of a profound kind, and that has profoundly affected politics, creating completely new political structures of the right and left. A very simple way of thinking about this is our societies have in their income distribution and in some ways their economies, growth has also slowed, become more like Latin America. And as a result, our politics look more like Latin America. Namely, it's increasingly become a competition between populists of the left and populists of the right, with the old center disintegrating. And it's in the center, I have a wonderful quote from Aristotle which supports this. He observed that in the Greek city-states. It's in the center that the compromises formed that allow a political community to function smoothly. We end up with a profoundly polarized political community, the most extreme version in a major democracy now is in the United States. And in those contexts, liberal democracy don't really function because people are no longer prepared to lose. And if people are not prepared to lose, they regard the opponents as illegitimate, as fundamentally illegitimate, then democracy can't function.
So one of the issues you raised that might surprise some people was that you seem to think that the immigration into, well, two issues, that the globalization of, let's say, middle to low-end jobs to poorer countries is not as important in the troubles of the West as some people seem to think, and that migration is more important. But what if maybe you would see it slightly differently? Can you talk about those two issues briefly? And then, of course, technology, which
Yes.
has been a very big factor in changing the realities of the rich countries.
I think it's important to distinguish, and this is where your myths and realities come up in a different way, the things that cause really significant economic change from the things that have caused profound political change. They're not the same. I think the evidence is pretty clear that the globalization of trade and the globalization and the level of immigration we've actually had in the developed world have not led to huge destabilizing impacts on what I call the old working class, broadly defined. The less educated, people who left school without going to university, that these are obviously are losers, are relative losers, but it doesn't turn out that these forms of globalization have really been very profound economically. They have had effects, there's no doubt. It is true, both have been the subject of hostility, profound hostility, because it's always easy. We know this so well from history. When people are unhappy, the most natural thing to happen in politics is for people to blame outsiders. I mean, it's the first thing that happens. That was the story of the 30s. We all know this. I certainly know this. So they blame outsiders, and they blame foreigners. So it's Chinese people or Vietnamese people, or it's the immigrants from Poland or whatever it may be. But I actually think, and I think it was really very clearly supported both by the Brexit campaign and by Mr. Trump's rhetoric, that the political salience of immigration is very, very profound. I stress the political salience because, and this is the way I think about it, democracy is connected with a political community which is attached to a particular jurisdiction, which is an area of land ruled by a political constitution, to which everybody joins, every adult joins, and the young people will ultimately join as citizens. That's the idea. It's the idea, obviously, of South African modern citizenship. It's the idea of any democratic polity, is this idea we share in this polity. And there is, I argue, a very strong view that that creates a tie of mutual belonging through the state, which was enshrined in the modern Western world in the middle of the 20th century in the welfare state. That was a direct contract of insurance protection for the mass of the people, with the better off paying more to support a certain standard of living. So that was made concrete in political form. And associated with that is, of course, the idea, and it's also connected with jobs, that the state, the democratic state, has a primary responsibility to the people who live in that country. And that's the first thing that they're responsible for. This is sort of a premise of democracy. Now, the reason immigration, if it's not controlled, shatters this is that people then start saying, well, there are all these outsiders to whom I feel no obligation and to whom I feel no connection, who are just apparently just able to walk in and take advantage of the situation, maybe take our jobs, maybe not, come and live next to us, send their children to our schools. I want this to be under control because this state belongs to me and my children. Now, this is an old story. Immigration has always created conflict like that. It did in America throughout the 19th century. And when it resurged dramatically, as it did in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, and then for the first time, Europe became a large net recipient of immigrants, immigration became a talismanic issue. And the fact that the immigrants, by and large, were people from different continents unquestionably exacerbated this fear. So we ended up, and I'm not saying this is we ended up with a totemic issue, which allowed politicians, particularly on the right, to split the demands coming, because the old working class had disappeared from below, into minority demands from ethnic minorities and demands from white people like us, as it were. Race became a very significant factor in politics, more or less everywhere. So that's the specific issue why I think immigration is politically more salient, but I don't believe it's economically more salient. I think the evidence is pretty clear that neither is being crucial. The biggest thing that has been going on is the massive deindustrialization of our economies, and it is absolutely clear that the dominant force behind the deindustrialization of our economies, with all the social and economic consequences, has been technology. And just to get to where we might be going, I mean, industry is following the track of agriculture, it's becoming a sector which is so immensely productive that actually no one needs to work in it anymore. And the result has been a colossal social change associated with economic development.
Sorry, Martin, I'm having terrible troubles with my connection today for some reason. I'm going to turn my picture off. I don't know where you got to, but I lost the last minute or so.
Oh dear. Well, I think I answered your question, and we'll assume that the answer,
Okay.
that the audience heard my answer, and let's move on. I just tried to explain why immigration was politically more salient than globalization. But let's be clear, globalization, broadly defined, is a whipping boy in this situation. It's a useful whipping boy because it's so nice for everybody to agree that foreigners are the problem.
Let me turn now to coin a phrase, what is to be done? What are your recommendations? I found this great quote from you where you said that none of today's dominant systems are working well. Capitalism is innovative, but creates huge social, political, environmental challenges. Liberal democracy is corroded even at its core, but the authoritarian politics that challenge it are vastly worse. Unaccountable rule by gangsters or brutal bureaucrats is deeply depressing. So I know this is a big question, but perhaps you can give us a flavor of how you think we should renew democracy and how you think we should renew capitalism. Perhaps one or two issues, or how you want to summarize it for us, or give us a taste.
Well, okay, this is the chapter I'm just finishing. So broadly speaking, I think the way I think about this, we have a domestic challenge and a global challenge. And the difficulty is that the way we solve our domestic challenges, which I'll come to in a moment, which is the focus of your question, must be compatible with resolving our global challenge, which is, for the first time in the history of the world, humanity has become so dominant on our planet that it has to take responsibility for its functioning. And we are hitting so many environmental boundaries. And so global cooperation is essential. And that's only going to be possible, I think, if we change the way we organize ourselves domestically. And the way we organize ourselves domestically is going, in the first place, to have to pay a little bit more attention to our domestic political compact. So I'll focus on this domestic organization point first and foremost, and then discuss a bit what it might mean globally. I would like to stress that I think very strongly there are no solutions to problems like this. All solutions create new problems, but I do think that we've got the balance wrong, and we're going to have to re-emphasize this idea of citizenship as a central element if we're going to restore healthy democracies. So we are going to have to create a situation in which we simply have to create a situation in which the great majority of our people in our democracy, so I'll just focus on the development, feel they have hope for the future, and hope for the future collectively and individually, basic security, and so forth. So we're going to have to rebalance somewhat back towards where we were in the 50s and 60s, with a stronger support system on several dimensions. And this is going to be very difficult for reasons I won't be able to go into detail, because I think the fundamental underpinnings of growth for our economies have clearly weakened a great deal, and it's not easy to see how they'll be resolved. So we're not going to be able to go back to that world. We just are going to have to try some of it. So what are the elements of this? Well, we're going to have to do the very best we can to promote growth. And that means investing more, clearly investing more by the public sector and the private sector. It means putting a lot of resources into supporting innovation, frontier science, innovation, and the diffusion of innovation through our economies. So that becomes a little more of the sort of thing we saw in the earlier years of the Cold War. We're going to have to accept the profound change in our economy. We're not going to be able to generate huge jobs in industry or anything like that, but we're going to have to impart some of the security that was associated with those old industrial jobs to the new jobs of the gig economy and all the rest of it. And that will mean having labor laws that support that to some significant degree, accepting reasonably high minimum wages, which will almost certainly require wage subsidies to be, and we've already gone a long way towards that as part of our economic system. The government will have to go back, I think, towards providing housing, which is something it did in the early post-war period in many countries and has since basically withdrawn from, and that hasn't worked very well. So we've got to increase the supply of decent housing to people. We need to put immense resources into education for everybody. Lots of children are falling behind because their parents don't have good jobs, their families are not stable. That has to be offset to the greatest possible extent. So child benefits are very, very important in this society. Lots of families with children are really poor. And if that's the situation in your society, you really can't expect education to work well. We have to provide skills training across the entire post-18 generation, not just people who go to university, which is creating a deeply divided country. And to do all this, richer people, better off people are going to have to pay some more tax, which I think is fine. Who've been done in our societies, the upper middle class and upper class have done spectacularly well, includes people like me. I see no reason why we shouldn't pay more tax, because that is the only way we can recreate to some extent the sense of social cohesion that we've lost in the center. So it's a rebalancing of our system. I don't think we need to move against, well, relatively free world trade in this situation, but I do think we need to convince our people, and that's very clear from the experience in the US, UK, Italy, France, that we control our borders with respect to immigration. So that gives you some flavor of the thing. So it's not a radical reformation. This leaves aside, of course, let me go back to that, these huge global challenges, which require global cooperation, of which the most important are things like climate, the biosphere, and so forth. So somehow we're going to have to go more national and more global at the same time. And right now, I have to say, I don't think this is at all likely, but it's clearly what we have to do. And that's why this is a crisis. That's what defines this as a crisis, that what we have to do requires us to go in two different directions at the same time. Because what I'm definitely opposed to, because I think it would be a disaster, is the result of all this is to go completely inward looking and protectionist, and we end up back in the 30s, which will be a catastrophe. I'm losing you at the moment.
A lot of big challenges, Martin. Thank you for giving us a flavor of your new book, and we certainly look forward to reading it as soon as it comes out. I think, as you've said, the marriage of liberal democracy with capitalism is going to need a lot of nurturing, and it should certainly not be taken for granted. I want to move from the book and future you. The obvious question from South Africa is, well, what about the developing countries? Far too many people, not you, analyze what's happening in the rich world, and they generalize to the rest of the world, when developing countries are in many respects in a different situation. After all, over the past few Sorry, this is terrible. Perhaps I can get you to talk about the developing countries and how you see what your analysis means for countries outside the rich world, which in many respects have seen a vast reduction in poverty, and we've seen a reduction in global inequality. So what is your analysis from the core of liberal democracy mean for developing countries going into the future?
Well, one of the many reasons I didn't write much about developing countries in this is that my view is that while developing countries share a problem of being relatively less well off, apart from that, they're all dramatically different. Dramatically different in their economic performance, their economic opportunities, their political systems, obviously their associated cultural and political values. So making generalizations about developing countries is sort of completely hopeless. And I know enough about this to know that one has to be very specific. Even in my discussion of developed countries, it's perfectly obvious the United States is very different from Europe. It has huge assets, which Europe doesn't have, and also disadvantages. So one has to be very careful about this. If we look at the last 50 years, so it's a long period, we can see that some developing countries have been spectacularly, unbelievably successful, and have transformed the world, completely as a result. And this is predominantly, not unique exclusively, but predominantly, of course, in East Asia, and particularly in the last 30, 40 years with the rise of China. But before that, of course, they were following the path of Japan and Taiwan and Korea. So we've seen a path of development that works sensationally well, which is, if you like, the classic path. It starts with textiles and it ends up with high tech. For various reasons, which can go into detail, they've done this very, very well. What is interesting about these countries is most of them started off autocratic, and with the key exception of China, they only started moving to democracy. I mean, if you think about Taiwan and Korea, which is a particularly interesting case, after they got pretty well off. So the early period, their path was really a bit like 19th century Europe. They started autocratic and they ended up more democratic. Once their people had already got highly educated, lots of good jobs, I think that turned out to be quite attractive. But there are very few places that have managed that dynamic. There are other parts of the developing world which really aren't catching up at all. Probably the most important example of that is South America. Most South American countries are no richer relative to the advanced countries today than they were 40 years ago. They're caught in what is sometimes called the middle income trap. Well, we can have a whole discussion of why that happened and what they should do about it, but it's clearly very, very unattractive. Then there are countries which are much poorer than these nations, which have started to grow pretty rapidly. India is, I think, the most important example of that, though it's had a bad recent years. The last 30 years have really been pretty successful for India. And in Africa, it's quite diverse, as you know very well. So it's very difficult to summarize this. I do think there are two specific aspects of this which some way are shared. If development is to proceed successfully, experience would suggest you need quite a high level of social cohesion, a sense of being together in this, and particularly that you have governments which are able to provide the essential public goods without too much difficulty and which are regarded as legitimate. I think that's an important part in different ways of what these nations have had. And of course, it helps, in addition, if there is a great demand for and a supply of education. I mean, that's one of the things they've done really, really, really well, universal education. Korea is now the most highly educated country in the world. It's got more people with PhDs and university education than anywhere else. It's incredible from where they were 60, 70 years ago. That's an indication. So that's one thing, a cohesive society that is driven towards development and understands how to share out the responsibilities and bear the burdens. The second aspect, of course, is that some of these countries, above all China, remain firmly and profoundly autocratic. I mean, autocracy doesn't really define such a totalitarian system, and it's therefore generating what looks like an alternative model. My own feeling is that it's not a model that pretty well anywhere else in the world can adopt. China is in many ways unique, and I also think it's a model that will ultimately not work well for China. But one has to recognize we've got a superpower now, still relatively poor, which is a pole in the world, a great power, an immensely important, the biggest trading power in the world, which operates on a completely different basis, politically at least, from the West. So the world is split in that way. And that's the context, it seems to me, for the developing countries. How much can they exploit the existing opportunities, which depends on what they can do and how the opportunities unfold, and how that relates with the politics they have at home and this new emerging politics globally. These are very, very big challenges.
That's true. Let me turn to a topic you and I have talked about in the past, and that I think is really important for the world and for South Africa. And it's the role of the corporation in society. You've recently participated in a very important symposium looking at the famous Milton Friedman New York Times op-ed about business. And you've argued that you've changed your view. So I wonder if you could tell us the essence of the Milton Friedman position and where you have changed your view. And then I want to push back a little bit at you.
Well, the most important change of view I have is on something which probably Milton Friedman wouldn't really disagree with me on, which is how you interpret this. So Milton Friedman said that it is the job of companies to maximize profits, basically. That you can interpret that as maximizing shareholder value. That's an interpretation of this, provided they play by the rules of the game. But he didn't discuss what the rules of the game were and how they're formed. But he obviously meant by that the rule of law and as decided, and the law as decided by democratic legislatures. My particular problem is that it's pretty clear, and one of the themes of my book, that as capitalism has developed, there are some aspects, and very important aspects of the market economy that really don't work very well. And the most important aspect of that, I think, is particularly related to new technology, the breakdown of the transformation, if you like, of the competitive arena that a lot of the new players have vast market power. And that market power, as has always been understood, needs to be brought under control. And that's also true of the financial sector in crucial respects. And that power was so great that they had to be rescued when they all got into trouble together not so long ago. So the emergence of the tech sector and the emergence of the new financial sector has created a profound challenge for government. The problem government has is that the companies that they wish to regulate are dominant political actors because of their huge resources. Basically, they bought politics. And so I argued in that piece for the Chicago Symposium that people are asking themselves, who forms the rules of the game? If the people who should be operating within the rules of the game make the rules of the game, you don't have a democratic system and you don't have competitive capitalism. You're moving into a rentier system. And a rentier system is the oldest form of economic system in the world. You might say it's the standard form. What is a rentier system? It's one in which politics and wealth are controlled by the same people, and they use politics to support their wealth, and they use their wealth to control politics. That's feudalism. That's most political systems in history. Democratic capitalism should be the opposite, but it's always subject. One of the big dangers of democratic capitalism is that if the capitalists do well enough and are rich enough, they can take over politics. It becomes oligarchic or plutocratic. Aristotle discusses that too. And I think that's where we moved. So one of the main arguments in my book is that the capitalists have to be pushed back out of politics. They have to be, otherwise we can't retain a competitive capitalism or a competitive democracy. And that's something, I don't say that Friedman would disagree with that. I think he would agree with that. He just didn't see it as a relevant danger 50 years ago, but it's very clearly a relevant danger now. You just look at some of the, and I give some arguments in the book. I mean, the overwhelming domination in the US of donations from the immensely wealthy is very, very disturbing for a Democrat. I don't believe that's democracy. So now there are secondary issues, I think, which are to do with the structure of corporate governance and the conditions under which shareholder value maximization might lead to profoundly destabilizing behavior with regard to the environment and many other things. I think, though, once we get them out of politics, we can handle those things through the normal political process. But there is a debate about how far the need to take account of the externalities associated with corporate behavior has to be internalized in corporate governance and in the purpose of the corporation. And on that, at the moment, I would say I'm agnostic. So I don't feel so passionately about changing the governance of companies. I'm very open to different views about how companies should be governed. There are many different structures, by the way, even in the developed world, on how companies are governed. And I'm very happy to see experiments on that. But to me, that's not the focal issue. The focal issue is politics has to be free to set a framework within which market actors operate. Otherwise, the system collapses.
Martin, let me push back a little on this issue. Let me put it simply. You know, one goes to the UK and discovers that Amazon or Facebook don't pay any tax. And this is surprising and outrageous in my view. But many people then blame the company for that, the corporate sector. And you're saying it's because they bought the legislature effectively. But I'm not sure it's as simple as that. So on the one hand, I agree with those people who are saying that the West has allowed their states to become weaker. And that's been part of the consequence of let's call it the Reagan-Thatcher revolution, that the state are as well manned as it should be, and that states should be stronger and there's been some accommodation. So it's been very difficult for states to know how to tax companies, and the OECD is looking at this now. But I also think there's been a failure of states which are not simply bought by companies. On one hand, in America, if it were that simple, maybe Michael Bloomberg would have been a much more stronger political candidate. And on the other hand, you have other interests with enormous power. Think of the teachers' union. Pushing back in terms of the state, it seems to me, could be doing more. And it's not as, you know, you'd need to prove to me law by law how companies have bought the state. And on the other hand, that there are other very powerful interests as well. It's not just companies supporting the democratic politics. Sorry, Martin, are you hearing me?
I've got, I think, most of it, but there's so much to say, and we're nearly at the end of this. So I think there are different countries have different opportunities and different politics. So I'm certainly not trying to argue that politics are perfect. And I'm certainly not arguing that corporations are the only powerful interest, though I think it's pretty clear in modern society with the almost complete collapse of trades unions. You mentioned the teachers' unions, but they're basically all that's left. They're basically only public sector unions left. So the private sector is completely unorganized, and that effectively is dominated by corporates who have immense influence on labor law and many other things. But there are a few exceptions. Basically, public sector unions, particularly in the city context in the US, I think that's a marginal issue, but it's not nothing. I think we have to separate out, in a strange way, the US from the rest. The US is so large that it has very, very substantial degrees of freedom in setting the rules and regulations governing its corporate sector, because they don't have anywhere else to go. First of all, nearly all the dominant companies are American. I've just been looking at this. It is amazing how many of the dominant companies in the world are American, which of course is a sign of their health economically. It's an important sign of health, as well as the problems it creates. But it means the US could impose a tax system which avoided, which reduced the many loopholes that there are. If you look at, for example, the Trump tax cuts, which is a very, very big example, because it was the US corporate tax is so remarkably ineffective, which just doesn't need to be. They take so little revenue. I mean, that's very, very clear, a response to the fundamental role of the donor class, very small group, particularly the Koch brothers, in influencing the Republicans' platform, and there were many other important things: the carried interest loophole, the almost complete elimination of inheritance taxes, which are all obviously the consequence of essentially plutocratic political lobbying. So the evidence on this is, I think, really pretty clear in the US. I cite one paper which is quite an interesting paper. Nobody's refuted it, which argues that if you look at the laws that are passed in the US by both parties, by the way, they reflect far better the views and aspirations of the top 1% than of the median voter. So it's an anti-median voter system, and I think that's to do with the way the politics I described has evolved in the US. Now, this has effects globally. There is no other country that can make these decisions without paying very serious attention to the possibility that as a result of making these decisions, companies will simply leave their country. They have far less degrees of freedom, at least. The EU could coordinate on tax, but they've never been able to do so. And they find it very difficult to coordinate even on competition policies, so they're more advanced in that regard. So basically, this is a problem. This is a genuine problem with globalization, not of trade, but of the movement of companies across borders, of course, can generate a race to the bottom. And the response to that is to agree on regulation. You mentioned the case of the taxation of Facebook or Amazon. Well, there's some pretty incredible things. I've got a wonderful chart in my book which shows that the immense increase in the profits reported, I mean, just immense in the last 15 years in 7 tiny jurisdictions, the Bahamas, the Seychelles, none of which, of course, have any activity going on. This is complete fraud. And that's happening. Governments can only deal with that by cooperating. Now, it is true, and this comes back to my earlier point, to make this new world work, we have to respond to domestic concerns, but we can only make it work by cooperating better. So, companies can move, governments have to cooperate. That's one of the huge challenges. But I think part of the resolution here, and that is, of course, part of the genuine problems, part of the resolution here is, particularly in the US, to reduce the role of companies and government in politics. I don't expect that to happen, by the way. I think it's very unlikely, and that's one of the reasons why I don't think these problems are likely to be resolved, and we're likely to see more populist politics. I do think it's important to not to reduce the significance of what's going on. I mean, the simple truth is that the last outgoing president of the United States tried to launch a coup against the democratic process. That's what he tried to do. He was unsuccessful because he's very bad at it. But the next guy will be much better. I mean, I don't think it's at all obvious that 10 years from now, America will still be a functioning democracy. So this is a very, very big set of issues that we're talking about. And companies play some role in this. They're not the dominant ones, but they certainly play a role in this, in the transformation of a democratic polity, or the recreation of this democratic polity as an outright plutocracy. And that's a very great danger, in my view, and not desirable. Plutocratic states really work badly because they're rentier states, almost by assumption. They're rentier states.
Well, unfortunately, we've come to the end of our time together. I would love to continue this conversation about all the issues, about business, about democracy, and about liberalism. Martin, I can only say thank you so much for indulging me, jumping around on all these issues. And it's been fantastic. And we really appreciate you giving us this time. And I think I speak for many on this call that we're really looking forward to your new book and hopefully further debate with you once we've read it and can engage with you on the basis of that. So thank you very much indeed for joining us in South Africa today, even if only virtually.
It was a great pleasure.
Privilege. Thank you.
As
Thanks,
always.
Martin.
Great pleasure.
Great. Well, everybody, thanks for joining us today. Unfortunately, our hour is over, and we look forward to seeing you at our next event. So thank you for joining us. And thank you very much to Kuben Naidu for joining us today, and a big thank you to Martin. This event is over.